I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael O'Keefe. I hope you all are with us. And yes, of course, Michael is well known to many of us in Fiji, where he's worked as an advisor to the Fijian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, National Security and Policing. He's also known very fondly by scores of his former students of international relations in Fiji. Of course, Michael is now with Trobe University. He's the Director of Master of International Relations Program. His main research interests include Australian foreign policy, Pacific region foreign policies, especially Fiji, and Pacific regionalism. His current projects focus on Australia's step up in the Pacific, Fiji's peacekeeping strategy, and military diplomacy. He undertakes a wide range of consultancies in the Pacific and is stored in Fiji and Japan. Michael, lovely to have you, and you have the floor.
Thank you for that introduction, Ambassador Nair, and apologies for the little technical glitch that we had there. I will just get straight into it, and hopefully we'll be able to catch up time. Now, I've shared screen. Can everyone see my screen? Is that presentation there?
Lovely,
yeah?
Mike. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is answer that question, whether or not it's simply geopolitics. I'll begin very briefly by introducing myself, but Robin's basically done that. I'll talk about what Australia's national interests are, and I want to remind us and keep that as background context to this conversation. I'm going to introduce a very practical theoretical frame, looking at Australia's unique strategic culture as a driver of foreign policy. Then I'm going to detail strategic culture, connect that with the crowded and complex geopolitics of the region and what's going on in particular from the region looking outwards in relation to the Blue Continent, and then identify some of the pressure points, opportunities and challenges because Australia is also facing a more divided and vulnerable region, not just in relation to the fragility of regionalism at the moment, but also the very significant impact of COVID-19. And I've got a few case studies, which if we're running out of time, I can cut short. Robin has explained that I've done a bit of work in the Pacific over the years. I haven't been there for a couple of years, unfortunately, due to COVID-19. But in the photo that's in the top left of the photo that you'll see, there's Robin and I at the University of Fiji when Robin invited me to come and teach international relations on numerous occasions. Very fond memories of those times and outstanding students who've now gone on and done very interesting and wonderful things. I won't dwell on those photographs, but I've done work in response to climate change impacts in places like the Hapai region of Tonga. That's that photo in the middle, and worked on the Pacific Islands Development Forum, which again is an interesting challenge to regionalism in itself and a way of sort of reframing the region. And that photo at the bottom right is with a couple of colleagues on Overlau working on a project on NCDs. So anyway, I come at this from a sort of a broad interest in the Pacific, but my big focus is on geopolitics and foreign policy. So in short, I thought I'd start by answering the question very quickly, and then I'll explain why. So no, it's not simply geopolitics, but geopolitics is more important than ever. And in saying that, I'll bracket geoeconomics. I'm not going to go into economics very much at all. And the reason I'm not is because of how insignificant the Pacific is when it comes to Australia's export-oriented economic outlook, particularly in relation to climate change and all of the exports that Australia does in relation, in particular, to liquefied natural gas and coal and those sorts of things. But Australia is a regional hegemon, and Australia, I'm going to argue, is both a sheriff and a humanitarian. And this is where it becomes really nuanced, and we have to understand that there are trends tugging at Australian foreign policy at any given moment. And that's how we can come to understand it. But that means that there are challenges and opportunities for Pacific Island countries, and that's what I'm going to end on, is just pointing out that actually there's some great opportunities here for Pacific Island countries in dealing with Australia because of how important geopolitics now is to Australia, and that could be in framing their own relations, bilateral relations, overseas development assistance, and those sorts of things. So the background assumption that I just want us to nail here, and that we really need to have in our minds, is that Australian foreign policy is for Australians. Okay, and while there's a lot of declaratory rhetoric that goes around about Pacific family, and I'll be going into some of that, Rivalry, those sorts of things, we've got to be really clear that ultimately the Prime Minister is elected by the Australian people, and his primary role is to provide for the security and prosperity of Australian citizens. Okay, that means that it's not the asylum seekers, and you've seen Australia's asylum seeker policy and the Pacific solution. It's not climate change, it's not Wales, and it's not Pacific Islanders either. And that's where this big tension over climate change comes in, because ultimately for Australia to compromise on climate change by reducing the export of all of those products I mentioned earlier will undermine Australia's prosperity, according to the view from Canberra. Okay, so we really need to keep that in mind. That's the pressure point, how to balance those sorts of issues. And Australia does support a liberal rules-based order, and we see that a lot in declaratory policy, but we've got to be clear, that's a rules-based order that supports Australia's interests. And again, the asylum seeker issue is a really good example of that, where if it's not in Australia's interest to compromise on that issue, then Canberra will not do so. And we saw the impacts of that for decades. So Australia has a strategic culture, and we can't understand it without looking at the strategic culture. And this is an area that I'm very interested in because of all my work on defense. And what is strategic culture? It's a distinctive and lasting set of beliefs, values, and habits regarding the threat and use of force, which have their roots in such fundamental influences as geopolitical setting, history, and political culture. So much of international relations would like us to be completely blind to the history of a particular state or where it's situated. And what I want to do very briefly is highlight some of the aspects of Australia's strategic culture in relation to the South Pacific that we also must keep in mind in answering that question, is it simply about geopolitics? The first key point about Australia's strategic culture is that it's Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American. Australia never decolonized, never fought for independence. It never decolonized. So there's a cultural affinity with the empire, the British Empire, and then that's transferred through to the Americans. And that affinity is above any other geographic or other identity. So Australians may feel more closely aligned with England than they do with Asia or Oceania or the Pacific. As part of this, Australia always felt that it was an Anglo-Saxon outpost in a hostile environment, never integrating in the region, never being a part of the region. There's no sense that Australia is an Asian country, for instance. And we've had these debates, and Paul Keefe was a very good sponsor of this sort of debate over Asianization in Australia. But this strategic culture of seeing us as being an outlier remains important and essential to the way Australians see themselves. And then within this, there's a view that Australia is a very large continent, an island continent that's indefensible. That because of the small population, Australia can't defend itself. And this builds an exaggerated sense of threat and fear, and then dependence upon great and powerful friends. And this is where the submarine deal that we've all seen in the news comes in. That high level of threat, exaggerated threat. And what do? You rely on the technology from your great and powerful friend, the United States, to save you from the threat, in this case of China, but it was Indonesia, or it was communism, or it was the Russian Empire. There's always been a sense of threat. One of the biggest implications of this is there's a huge amount of continuity or inertia in Australia's foreign policy and defense strategy. You know, the key indicator of what happened, what's going to happen tomorrow, is what happened yesterday. And if you look at the submarines, that fits that really neatly. There's a capability that Australia is not just purchasing again, but it's upgrading. So we see it in the armament, the huge amount, $44.6 billion now spent on defense each year. More than 2% of GDP, and that's the only time, other than while we've been in an active war, that Australia has spent that much. Okay, and that's an indicator of what the priorities in Canberra. Alliance, this new alliance and new forms of integration of the Western Alliance, if we want to call it that. Again, another example of focusing on great and powerful friends and how the United States and the United Kingdom loom large in Canberra's view of its security. And then built into that, there is this tension where internationalism and regionalism, the cooperative tendencies in Australian foreign policy, are also evident. And this is where we might see overseas development assistance, and in particular, the focus on the Pacific in that respect. So it exists and coexists with a very narrow view of armament and self-reliance. And that's what we see, and why sometimes it's hard to translate or understand what exactly is going on in Australian foreign policy. And then another very important contextual point is the proximity counts. And Australia, we have these very large images of the region that we live in. We've been in the Asia Pacific, the yellow section, for many years. We've defined it Asia Pacific, even though the Pacific was almost missing from that. Then we've now got this Indo-Pacific that moves and adds the orange areas to that. So this is a very large area of the earth that Australia is treating as our area of primary strategic concern. Again, that's why you need nuclear submarines to be operating in the Sea of Japan, for instance. But we also need to understand that proximity counts, and the closer you get to Australia, to its shores, the more elevated the view from Canberra. So we have these terms like our backyard and our neighborhood. This sense and neighborly relations require a different sort of relationship than you would normally see in international relations. This isn't just transactional. Right? Neighbours don't just operate in a transactional way. And that is some of the reason why Australia is both a regional hegemon and a humanitarian in the South Pacific. So what we see, the implications in relation to the South Pacific, are that strategic denial is a key habit in Australian policy. And that map on the right shows the extent of the Japanese Empire in 1942. And that was a time that defined Australia's threat perceptions. At that stage, they weren't exaggerated because the Japanese Empire was right on Australia's doorstep, right through the top of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. But today, it's China that looms large. And it's the fear that something like this could happen again. The fear that the Chinese empire could expand through the South China Sea, and we've all seen what's been going on in that context, and then further nearby into the South Pacific. So Australia wants to repulse unwelcome external powers, not friendly powers, so not the United States or the United Kingdom or even France, regardless of the current fallout, but any unwelcome power that wants to meddle in Australia's backyard. And that highlights Australia's feeling of regional hegemony. The feeling that it is a powerful state, that it will support regional institutions that suit its interests, both trade and also through political means. It also highlights Australia being the #1 development assistance partner in the region, and having been that way for some time, and having now stepped up even more. The very, very strong focus that Australia puts on military diplomacy, primarily, of course, with the Pacific Island nations that have militaries, and that would be, Papua New Guinea and Fiji and Tonga, but also paramilitary forces, policing forces, patrol boats to deal with exclusive economic zones, piracy, and all of those things. And then, of course, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, wanting to be the partner of choice to respond to a cyclone, to feel obliged to respond to a cyclone in the backyard. So that's what Australia does. That's a pattern, and it's a tried and true pattern that we've seen throughout the last century and since Australia became independent. So this focus on power has to be connected to this other view of proximity. And it is really worth us elevating that, because in international relations, if we're only worried about power and alliances and submarines, it misses the human part of this. And these photos sort of highlight some of that. That photo at the top is of RFMF, Fijian military operating in Australia after the fires. So there is Fiji providing Australia support when Australia needs it. And a huge amount was made of that in Australian media and polity. This sense of affinity between Australia and Pacific Island countries. It comes through tourism, it comes through investment, sport, and all those sorts of things. But at the same time, a sense of responsibility, Australia as a big brother. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing for Pacific Island countries. But what I guess I'm trying to emphasize is that these themes play themselves out in Australian foreign policy on a daily basis, and more so when there's a geopolitical challenge. So now everyone's looking at the region. It's not just Australia with its step up. We have the British and the Chinese and French. Everyone is interested in the region more than they have been, mostly for their own reasons, mostly looking from the outside in. They're not looking from the inside out. And my esteemed colleague Tess, who's going to commentate, she's written a lot about listening to the Pacific. And we've seen this, with the last Pacific Islands Forum meetings and the concerns over climate change, a lack of listening. This is all looking from the outside in. And as another colleague of mine talks about it, is I think probably the best way of capturing it. It's crowded and complex. There's a lot of actors, and Australia, because of the strategic culture I mentioned earlier, feels a sense of threat. It feels urgency in its action. And that's why we've seen all of this effort going into the step up. So it's been variously described by the Prime Minister or by DFAT as a new chapter in relations with the Pacific family, and always connecting it to these personal, historical, and cultural ties. Okay, so we could say that Australia has seesawed in and out of the Pacific in its history, and this is just yet another sort of high tide. But it also could be that because of the threat of China, that we're going to see a much longer term emphasis where Australia doesn't practice benign neglect, where Australia actually stays engaged. And the first part of this is, as the Prime Minister said, showing up. Now, we're yet to see whether or not that is a significant trend, but the first point is to be made. If you're going to step up, you need to show up. And we see this in the Rivalry agreement, the Prime Minister being the first Prime Minister to visit the Pacific Islands twice in 1 year. And intense diplomacy over these various issues. We've seen a whole range of investment in the Office of the Pacific Fusion Center increased or redirected overseas direct investment. We've seen an infrastructure financing facility, which is undersubscribed at the moment, but focuses the attention on what China was doing and doing so well in providing infrastructure support rather than just looking at building capacity. And then the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme, a key sensitive point for Pacific Island countries, and tinkering and modifying on the part of Australia, and of course New Zealand as well, in relation to providing more of what they think the Pacific Islands need. And this strategic denial then for Australia focuses on defense and security issues as well. So the Pacific Maritime Security Project, which sees a whole new Pacific patrol boat program, basically replacing what had been provided in the 1980s by the Hawke Labor government, and providing more and better craft to Pacific Island countries to allow them to protect their EEZs and to protect themselves against illegal and unreported fisheries or against transnational crime. But of course that's in their interest, but it's in Australia's interest too, because Australia is concerned about all of those things. And also it means that Australia becomes the security partner of choice. If Australia gives a piece of equipment, and it could be these patrol boats, or it could be the armored personnel carriers that were sold to Fiji, you sort of block out that sort of equipment and interaction from others for a whole generation, because these patrol boats will last for another 25 years or so. So Australia is positioning itself for the next 25 years to be that security partner of choice. And even recently, again, just in the last week with this AUKUS announcement, and again, the submarines, in that first statement that the Prime Minister made, a whole range of connections were drawn. But you can see he drew the connection between how it would be a positive impact on our dear Pacific family, if I could quote him. Now, that's a really interesting way of framing the Pacific in Australia's eyes. And it shows, again, friendship, it shows neighborly relations, and it's not just the transactional relations that you might see Australia with a country like France, which right at the moment is very upset about the transactional relations that have occurred over the submarine project. So that's all from the outside in. But what Australia is now facing are a range of trends in the region that are coming to a head. And the first, and a number of my colleagues have been involved in discussing the new Pacific diplomacy. increased diplomatic confidence. And I think this quote by Dame Meg Taylor really highlights it really clearly, saying that it isn't about a choice between China and the West. It isn't about Australia's threat perceptions. It's about how the Pacific interacts with other countries and what their interests are. And that's what we're seeing, a much clearer definition of the national interest by Pacific leaders, and therefore more tension if Australia thinks that its old habits are going to be able to hold sway and to stop Chinese influence. There are a whole range of unifying factors in the region. We know that the regional institutions have been strong, even though there's some challenge there. Climate change is a shared existential threat for the whole region. These states decolonized very late. They're very isolated and have large EEZs and large but small land masses, other than Papua New Guinea, really. And also they have a strong feeling of anti-nuclearization, which again now cuts across the submarines. So there is something to be said for this Pacific family from the Pacific looking out. But at the same time, we're also seeing strains in this Pacific identity, whether we call it the Pacific Way, which was Matamara's sort of conception, or how we define it. We can see there's a whole range of sub-regional machinations, and it could be through the MSG. We can see the PIDF. We can see the problem with the PIF and the recent election challenge, and whether or not it's going to be torn apart. We can see things like the problems with the University of the South Pacific, hitherto viewed as a very successful regional organization, but it looks like planning is already underway to see it maybe potentially break up. We've seen COVID vaccine diplomacy play out in a bilateral sense. This is not like a regional acceptance to it. Much of what's occurred has been bilaterally, and the bilateral relations between individual PICs and various other countries have been the reason why they've got whatever vaccines they've got and how many they've got at whatever time. We see a high level of dependence on overseas development assistance, and that's prior to COVID-19. And that again differs a country like Fiji, for instance, which has a very low dependence, and some other countries, Tuvalu, for instance, many countries where it goes to 50% or so. And then within all of this, with illegal fishing, etc., or logging, we have unsustainable development. So we have a circumstance where the Blue Pacific is actually forming an identity, but it's under a great deal of challenge. And that's what Australian diplomats are facing in attempting to then deal with China and geopolitics in the region. Where are these issues, the real pressure points? Well, climate change, of course, the real impacts on climate change, the transnational sort of changes that are occurring in relation to how we view these regions, the lost decade that my esteemed colleague Alex has written about development and how COVID-19 might impact, and then the geopolitical ambitions of extraterritorial states. And that could be Australia, its geopolitical ambitions, but it could also be China. Let's not forget Russia. Let's not forget Indonesia and its concerns about West Papua and those sorts of things in the MSG and elsewhere. So there's a lot more going on in this crowded and complex Pacific. And at the same time, Pacific Island countries are much more vulnerable. So Australia feels this connects directly with the points I was trying to make earlier about Australia's feeling of threat. It's interested in strategically denying other states' influence in the region. And because of the atomization of regionalism, or because of the impacts of COVID-19, there are many more opportunities and challenges for Australia. Tried and true method is to focus on your two largest countries, which have the largest population, largest landmass, largest GDP, and are also incredibly influential in all of those different regional organizations. But also then, Australia's increasing its diplomatic outreach to all other countries. And I'm then going to deal with a couple of case studies quickly, and I know that we're running late, so I am sort of trying to race through this, and that we will have plenty of time for questions to be able to deal with this. First case study is about basing and basing for PICs. Now, this is mainly, of course, states that have militaries. And the two key ones are the Manus Island base in Papua New Guinea and Black Rock in Fiji. Both of these bases meet a clear demand from the Pacific Island countries. And it's very clear that both countries negotiated really good deals that supported their their interests. It may be that in both cases, China was nearby or involved or attempting to be involved, and Australia did a whole range of negotiations to ensure that that they got the relationship on track. So there's a clear national interest motive, both for the PICs and for Australia. And Australia then is willing to provide this tried and true method of military diplomacy, providing cooperation, training, through life support, and those sorts of things. And what does it get? Just like with the maritime patrol boat system, it gets a situation where there are no Chinese bases, because that would be the thing that that Australia would fear the most. And that's what we saw with all the information that was bandied around the rumored base in Vanuatu. Climate change. There's no compromise on the part of the Australian government. The Australian government would like to give money for adaptation, etc., but PICs don't necessarily want money for adaptation. What they want is the problem, the existential threat, to be reduced by countries, not just Australia, but others, to meet their goals under the Paris Agreement. There's a picture, a famous picture of the Prime Minister holding up a coal in the Australian Parliament. And, you know, we are in a position now where Australia's prosperity is built upon the export of those various natural resources. And Australia is not willing to turn back. Okay, so not willing to compromise. And what we can see there, again, from the ex-Tuvaluan Prime Minister, is a quote about that. And we've seen the Fijian Prime Minister, we've seen this in the PIF, a lot of pressure on Australia. But what the Prime Minister has said straight out, and there he is with a steely look on his face at the last PIF, is that it's not in Australia's interest to compromise. It may be in the interest of Pacific Island countries, but it's not in Australia's interest, because Australia is on a neoliberal export-oriented path. And until that is shut down by the international system, I guess, if people stop buying coal, then Australia will continue to do so. So that means that Australia's credentials are challenged, and challenged in a way that China doesn't face, because the Pacific Islands treat their neighbor or friend differently. There's a double standard. They will criticize Australia in this respect, where they won't be criticizing China, even if China is the largest emitter, even if China, if it went to net zero, would be able to have a profound impact on climate change. But that's not the point. The point is, if you talk the talk of friendship and neighborly behavior, then you need to walk the walk, and not just show up, but meaningfully act. And that's what the Pacific is missing currently. We can see this as well in the increased ODA. So Australia's aid budget is shrinking, or not growing. But what we've seen is that actually within the budget, areas, whether they be in Africa or Southeast Asia, are being cut, and the South Pacific is being privileged. Okay, so it's refocusing on the areas in the Pacific that are really important, and this shows that national interest connects with altruism. This is where you can be a sheriff and you can be a humanitarian as well, where you can focus on your region, your threat basis and wanting to deny China a foothold, but at the same time, you do actually want to provide COVID-19 vaccines, and you would like to support education and gender outcomes in the Pacific Islands. There has been much talk of China's COVID-19 diplomacy in Africa and elsewhere. But again, what we've seen is Australia position itself as the partner of choice. And even in Fiji, I've lost count, but maybe over 600,000 doses of AstraZeneca coming to support the vaccination program there. So Morrison's signaled very early, before we even had vaccines, that the Pacific Island family must be the focus of international support, and has followed through on that. And we've seen that with things like the humanitarian corridor. We've seen a focus on health systems and as I said, vaccines. So we see that there is a liberal internationalist humanitarian part of this that's undeniable. But at the same time, if you are competing geopolitically with China, and China's using vaccine diplomacy as part of its geopolitical contest elsewhere, that could be in Southeast Asia or it could be in Africa, then Australia has stepped up in this regard too, and very, very adaptively ensured that it remains in that dominant hegemonic position. Who was it that provided those vaccines? It was Australia. And that, I think, will be remembered. And then I'm nearly done, just winding it up in relation to these submarines. And that's a quote, you know, the little fella from Australia down under has got submarines. And the submarines that Australia is getting, which may be based, let's say, on a United States Virginia class nuclear attack submarine, are a completely different submarine to the ones that we currently have, the Collins class, and also the French design. And their capacity to extend the reach of Australia's defense strategy through the Pacific and into Southeast Asian waters, right up to the coast of China, is unprecedented for Australia. Okay, it's in Australia's national interest to do this. It's also then had a direct impact on relations with France. But as I said earlier, the Prime Minister in his first speech connected this to the Pacific family and providing security for the Pacific family. So what's being argued, and I think many of us might disagree, but that the Pacific becomes more secure if Australia is able to fend off Chinese threat and the Chinese submarine threat. China already has nuclear submarines and many more diesel-electric submarines. But anyway, interesting twist on the way the Pacific family might be viewed, and worth mentioning for the purposes of us trying to understand Australia's foreign policy in this very, very complex geopolitical setting. So just to wind up, what do the submarines tell us? They're a litmus test. They show us very clearly that Australia's national interest, that realism is about power and about the threat that we feel in the region, is uppermost in the minds of Canberra. So it's not any other interest, the interest of Pacific Island countries, the interest of the United States or France or any others that are uppermost in Australia's mind. And we must always keep this in our minds when analysing Australia's actions. Pacific Island nations may be facing Australia better than they had been in the past, but and more confidently, but please, we must elevate this point. Australia is doing what is good for Australia, and then maybe also what's good for the region. And so the peace and stability and the strategic balance that the government wants to focus is a strategic balance that deals with Australia's threat perceptions. And as a number of Pacific Island leaders have said, Australia's threat perceptions are not Pacific Island threat perceptions. And we also have to keep that in mind. But there is some overlap, and we'll get to that in a minute. So when I was saying about strategic denial, denying access of other powers, this is a form of subsurface strategic denial. This gives Australia the capacity to engage in that sort of activity across the region in a way that it never could before. More submarines, better submarines, longer range, longer loitering capacity. And this is a fairly major escalation of Canberra's reach. This is Australia stepping up as this sort of powerful country. And what this does is it extends Australia's utility of force, what Australia thinks it can do with military force. The militarization of the Pacific, which I've written about a little bit, where Australia sees the Pacific through a military lens. It sees China's actions through a military lens, even if China is just only undertaking ODA like everyone else. And what the submarine purchase does, and connecting it to the Pacific, is highlight that that is a very powerful underlying point. So in the final slide, I just wanted to also highlight, even though the topic here today was Australia's geopolitics in the region, I just wanted to flip it for a minute and highlight that all of those things about Australia's unique position, which could pose challenges for the Pacific, also pose opportunities. So a challenge might be that it looks like Australia is not willing to compromise on climate change. But one of the opportunities here is that if there is a geopolitical contest going on, Australia is in a position to want to cooperate in other areas. So proximity accounts. Australia is not a Pacific Island country, but it can't escape its geography, and it's not willing to. Canberra's not going anywhere. Others will come and go. The Russians were interested in Abkhazia or Ukraine for a while, and at different times, Indonesia will be interested in trying to protect the situation in relation to West Papua. Australia's going nowhere. It's going to be in the Pacific forever, and that's something that the Pacific can take account of. Power counts, again, Australia does provide a huge amount of aid and is willing to continue that path. So it's about the Pacific meeting Australia and trying to shape the way Australia provides that aid. And the infrastructure facility is a good example of that, where instead of it just being the capacity building that suited Australia's interests in relation to gender, education, or other things, it's now much more focused on issues that might be relevant to the Pacific, even if the uptake on that project is very, very low. So Australia is very vulnerable on climate change. It may compromise very soon, but up to now, its vulnerability is a strength for the Pacific, because what it means that Australia is willing to compensate in various other areas, and that's where we will see maybe more opportunity for clever diplomacy and Pacific leadership looking outwards to make sure that Australia does listen and that the Pacific can achieve its interests and the welfare and prosperity of Pacific Islanders. On that note, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. As usual, very clear and comprehensive presentation. I saw a lot of lovely comments coming in, and I'm sure the question session will be very interesting. Today, we are very lucky. We've got a formidable group of expertise available to us. And after listening to Michael, we'll go on to the commentators now. I'll first of all ask Dr. Tess Newton-Cain to make her comments, and then it'll be followed by Mr. Alex Dayant, and finally Honourable Gavoka. As again, Dr. Tess Newton-Cain is also well known in the Pacific Island. She has developed professional and personal networks across the Pacific. She runs her own consultancy, T&C Pacific Consulting. She's a recognized thought leader on Pacific development politics and policy, drawing on extensive connections and years of experience based in the region. She has clients from government, the private sector, and civil society in the Pacific Islands. She's also associated with the Asia Institute at the Griffith University in Queensland. We are very fortunate to have her today to add value, response, and commentary on what Michael has been talking about. Tess, great to have you, and I give you the floor.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Ambassador, and thank you for the invitation to join you this afternoon, not this afternoon as it is here in Brisbane. I would like to, first of all, acknowledge the Indigenous owners and traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you today. Thank you, as always, Michael, for a fascinating paper, fascinating presentation, raising some really important issues. And I think one of the things that really struck me about the presentation that you gave us was that you were able to point to something very recent, very topical, such as the AUKUS announcement and the submarines, but fit this into a much wider and longer arc that has an historical aspect to it. It has significant political and diplomatic aspects to it, and I think that that's really important. I think obviously we've seen a lot more interest from scholars and the media and policy people in our part of the world, in the region, but I think a lot of it has tended to be quite sort of incident driven. So, X happens and therefore we say Y. And I think it's really important for these conversations that particularly Australian audiences have a much better understanding of where these things have come from and how they sit in a wider arc and in that historical sense. I think it's really important that where possible, those of us that do have an appreciation of that are able to share that with people that are willing to hear it. I think the other thing that I made a whole bunch of notes. There's a whole lot of things to touch on, but obviously, I don't want to take up all the time, and we've got questions to come, which I'm sure will raise others. I think for the Pacific people listening, for our colleagues in Fiji and elsewhere in the Pacific, the point that I really think we need to hone in on, and it's one is quite a simple one, but it's just hugely fundamental, and it's one that didn't really become apparent to me until I came to live in Australia, because I lived in Vanuatu for 20 years. And when you live in the Pacific, it is very easy to think that DFAT runs the world and they have huge amounts of influence and everybody's always asking them what they think. And then when you come to Australia, you realize that that's just not the case. And I think it's really important for our Pacific strategists, whether they're in Fiji or elsewhere, to really get their heads around this idea that it's the domestic policy drivers that count. It's domestic politics that count, and sometimes it's, you know, between domestic politicians. There are some really basic things that I think it's really important for Pacific diplomats and strategists to just keep in mind. One is the shortness of the Australian electoral cycle. So it's a 3-year cycle. It is ridiculously short. It took me a long time to work out why Australian politics was so weird. And part of it is this ridiculously short electoral cycle. So basically they're in campaign mode most of the time. I think the other issue is to realize that, you know, for example, the current government is a liberal national coalition. And that relationship, the details of that relationship are secret in terms of how it's negotiated as to who's getting what. And what we saw in terms of this new ASEAN agriculture visa essentially comes down to the nationals getting what they want out of that agreement. Now, you know, David Littleproud was, when this first came up, was forced by the ABC to address this issue of what does it mean for the Pacific Workers Scheme. It was perfectly clear he had no idea what the Pacific Workers Scheme was. He'd never heard of it. He didn't understand why he needed to know about it, despite the fact that he was the agriculture minister. So I think it's really important that from the Pacific looking to Australia, that people understand that the level of knowledge and engagement and policy clout when it comes to the Pacific is often quite low and can be very patchy. And there's no joined up thinking going on here. So even though we now have the Office of the Pacific, and part of its role is to provide this sort of brokering arrangement to make sure that everybody's thinking about Pacific or how what they do might affect the Pacific step up and foreign policy in the Pacific, it's not working very well. The Office of the Pacific is not particularly influential in Canberra terms. If you feel like you need to make friends with people that are influencing foreign policy in Australia, don't waste, the Department of Defence is where foreign policy happens at the moment in this country, particularly in the Pacific, but elsewhere generally. So, DFAT are very much on the outer, very much on the outer. And we can see that in all sorts of ways. There've been a few sort of missteps in the Pacific, sometimes cultural stuff, and people said to me, what are DFAT thinking? Why didn't they advise? And it's like, I don't think anybody's listening to DFAT. I'm on record for criticizing DFAT over a long period of time, but even I know that, DFAT wouldn't make those basic mistakes. So what that tells me is either DFAT's being asked and no one's listening to them, or more likely, no one's asking DFAT. So the DFAT's star is very much on the descent at the moment. Defence is very much in the ascendancy, and I think that this Michael's presentation has influenced that. And Michael and I have spoken before about the khaki tinge to the Pacific step up. Wes Morgan's talked about this as well, and I think we've seen that. We see it with the patrol boats, the bases that Australia is building. If you want to know who's building military infrastructure in the Pacific, it's Australia. Largely, they're building it to accommodate the New Guardian class boats because all the onshore facilities need to be upgraded, but they're building other things as well. And I think that is the reality in which we're currently working. It kind of suits Fiji in some ways because Fiji has a lot more a much more developed military infrastructure than most of the other Pacific Island countries. So they're able to have the sort of conversations. They've got counterparts for ADF people, which other countries don't have. Solomon Islands doesn't have a counterpart for Angus Campbell. Doesn't stop him going and being there in uniform, even though he doesn't have a counterpart to talk to. But those counterparts do exist in Fiji. Those channels of communication have been open for a very long time and survived, you know, even the sanctions after the coup. You know, they were significantly constrained, but they didn't die, and they were able to be resurrected and have been. So I'm going to stop there, Robin, because I'm keen to hear from the others and also the questions. But again, thank you very much, Michael. And yeah, my takeaways are, particularly for our Pacific colleagues, focus on the domestic politics here in Australia, because that's what everyone else is doing.
Thank you very much, Tess. It was very, very frank and refreshing comments as to who runs the foreign policy in Australia. Personally, I found it very interesting. Thank you very much. And you know, today I was listening to Radio National, and there was a person who has written a book, a recent book on Australia and the Pacific, and a history of Australia and the Pacific. And Geraldine Doug asked him about you know, what is the Australia's attitude towards the Pacific, and he described it as ambivalence. And the other thing that she asked him was about the Rivalry thing. Is it really, does Australia really regard the Pacific Islanders as family? And he said you know, it depends on, you know, what is, you know, it's whenever it suits Australia. That's what he said. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to Alex Dayant. As you know, Alex is from the well-known think tank, the Law Institute in Sydney. He's a research fellow in the Pacific Islands program at the Law Institute. His research focuses on all aspects of the Pacific, with a particular interest in development finance, economic governance, economic growth, trade and investment policy, and geoeconomics. We all know Alex is very well known for creating and leading the Pacific Aid Map, a data-driven project that traces aid flows to the region. Alex, we look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you, Robin, and thank you to the Fiji Institute of Applied Studies for inviting me today. You know, it's a real pleasure and honestly, like, I mean, an honor, really, to share the stage with such a huge caliber of experts on the Pacific. Honorable Gavoka, it's great to digitally meet you. Tess, it's always a pleasure to see you, and Michael, same, like, it's great to be connected. Look, I mean, Michael's presentation was really good. I've actually learned things, like, I usually don't approach the Pacific in such a lens. And I think Tess's comments were very insightful as well. So I just wanted to add a few words to this. To me, like, you know, geopolitics, obviously not without trade-off, is ultimately good for the Pacific on the critical assumption that Australia uses its renewed interest and efforts to help solve Pacific problems, which will in turn secure their own interests. And, you know, like, as Tess often mentions, like, it is important for Australia to listen to the region, listen to what they need, listen to what they want, but also what they don't want. And so, look, I mean, after listening to Michael's presentation, I thought that I'd rebound on a few things that he mentioned. The first is really, like, why is Australia in the Pacific? I mean, clearly, like, as you mentioned, there are, like, historical ties, there's the geographic component of it, and the current geopolitics. But I think the big question to understand is, like, why is the Pacific important to Australia on a foreign policy aspect? And I think the Pacific is important to Australia because the intent that Australia shows in the world, like how we want to organize ourselves as a country and what we want to stick to be in the world. I mean, those are fundamental questions of foreign policy. And the place in the world where Australia has the most influence, where we can do most to bring change, where we can do the most to help and support is the Pacific. And so who we are and what we are about in terms of foreign policy is a question which begins in the Pacific. If we're not thinking about it in that context, then we are unlikely to think about it in its full conception, because there are no other parts of the world where Australia could express itself so directly as in the Pacific. Now, to do this, we need to be able to listen properly to the Pacific, which is something again that Tess, I've learned a lot from Tess, and I think the biggest things I've learned from you, Tess, is that we need to always listen to what the Pacific, what the Pacific wants, but listen to the voice of the Pacific. Yeah, so yes, we need to provide the world with the leadership in listening to the region and what the Pacific needs to be done, what needs to be accomplished. And so, in this way, Australia's foreign policy charisma is at its peak in the Pacific relative to anywhere else in the world. And this is very well illustrated actually with the United States, who gradually look at Australia to know what to do in the region. I mean, in a sense, the Pacific is the one place in the world where Australia gets to demonstrate to the US and more broadly to the West what we look like as a leader. And in a sense, the Pacific defines Australia to the world. The rest of the world judges us by how we act in the Pacific, by what support we provide to the region. And so whether we like it or not, our action in the Pacific have a lot to do with how the world is seeing us. And this is why the Pacific is profoundly important to Australia's place in the world and our own understanding of the world. But that was one aspect that I wanted to highlight from Michael's presentation. Now, I'd like to spend 2 minutes, maybe not 5 minutes, on explaining why, we talk about the geopolitics in the Pacific from Australia. When we talk about geopolitics in the Pacific, I think most of the time we talk about China. This is what drives really. This is a big part of what drives Australia's activity, I think, in the Pacific recently. I mean, it's obviously not the only one, but it is important to understand the risks that China poses in the Pacific with an Australian point of view, to understand why Australia is acting in such a way. The first thing to say about China in the Pacific is that China has always had a presence in the region. I mean, ethnic Chinese have resided in the Pacific for centuries, running some of the region's oldest trading hubs. But since 2006, China's trade, aid, diplomatic, and commercial activity in the Pacific has been steadily and significantly scaling up. For all Pacific countries, China is a growing export market for the region's commodities such as lumber, raw minerals, oil and gas, and fish. And actually, excluding Papua New Guinea and Fiji, two-way trade with China has overtaken that of Australia since 2013 for most of the Pacific nations. So, for the Solomon Islands, for instance, two-way trade with China now makes up to 46% of all trade. And at the same time, China has also dramatically scaled up its activity in its aid activity in the region. As Robin mentioned earlier, I'm working on this Pacific Aid Map, a tool that traces aid flows from the international community to the Pacific. And we clearly see that between 2009 and now, China's role in the Pacific as an aid provider has increased, and actually China has provided close to $2 billion of foreign aid in the Pacific. So you could ask, why does it matter? I mean, why is this? Why should we worry about this? I mean, you could argue that this is a good thing for the Pacific, as the region faces significant development challenges, and China gives them an option, and in turn, greater influence over or attention from traditional development partners. But the thing is that foreign policy analysts in Canberra and other like-minded countries believe that China's growing footprint and influence in the Pacific presents two serious risks to their national interest. The first risk is really, which has a low probability of occurring, but which would have a profound impact, is that China, is trying to set up a military base in the Pacific, using its leverage through, diplomacy, debt, trade, and elite capture. This is a high impact because, it would shift Australia's, defense strategy completely. A Chinese military base as little as 2,000 kilometers away from Australia's eastern coast would force a wedge between Australia and its traditional strategic anchor, the United States. But this is, it has a very low probability of occurring because, the main reason for this is that, the Pacific governments are not simply pawns sitting between Australia and China. I mean, they have agency. And they have absolutely no interest in a further militarized region. Pacific nations are fiercely protective of their sovereignty, and I don't think we'll see a Chinese military base in the Pacific anytime soon. I mean, also, it would be just a nightmare for China to maintain such a facility in the Pacific. But the second risk, which has a lower impact but a higher probability of occurring, is that China and Chinese businesses, through elite captures and corruption, are rapidly undermining institutions of governance which Western development partners have spent considerable effort and time and resources trying to support. And this risk has a higher probability of occurring, particularly in light of the economic devastation facing the region as a result of COVID-19. So I think this in a way could justify the Australia's Pacific step up, and I'm not going to come back on the step up because I think, Michael, you explained it very well. One thing I would highlight though is that to me the most profound shift that happened through the Pacific step up has been the elevation and the integration of Pacific activities in the federal bureaucracy, the federal Australian bureaucracy. So, in 2007, the Pacific was represented and defined by one division and 3 branches. In 2014, after the merger with AUSAID and DFAT, and despite the massive aid management responsibilities, the Pacific was still only managed by 1 division and 4 branches. And today, the Office of the Pacific is a group within DFAT, with a deputy secretary, 3 divisions, and 9 branches. The whole of government oversight responsibility that the office retains also draws into personnel from the Attorney General's Department, the Australian Federal Police, Defense, Home Affairs, and other federal agencies working in the Pacific. And so, yes, DFAT is not the most important or powerful entity in the Australian government, but it is a little bit, it is connected through those other entities. And I think they have really the power to do something, that benefits the Pacific. And also, you look at the vaccine distribution, Australia is doing a great job into this. Well, it takes time, and but I think this is a tick box for the Australian government, right? Similarly, the economic support provided by Australia to help the region respond to COVID-19 has been pretty solid, and obviously more needs to be done. But it's a good point. And after you could talk about labor mobility and high-level visits and engagement with peers in the region. But now, I think you could argue that all of this is not being genuine and kind of pointless without any climate change action. And in a way, I would agree. Climate change is the most important security issue in the Pacific. But the reality is that this shifts. It has been a very long time since the Pacific has factors so centrally to Australia's foreign policy decision making, and the Pacific should really take advantage of this. I wanted to add a few words on AUKUS, but I think I'd rather actually start to take questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for your thoughts on the Pacific. Our final speaker today is Honourable Viliame Gavoka, is commonly known as Bill Gavoka at home. He's the leader of the Social Democratic Liberal Party, SODELPA, which is the main opposition party in Fijian Parliament. He's a member of the, he's of course himself a member of the Parliament. We are very privileged to have him on our panel today. Thank you very much, Honourable Gavoka, for your time. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for having me in this dialogue, Robin. Something that is very dear to my heart. Sometimes in Parliament, they say that I'm a lobbyist for Australia. I do realize how important Australia is to Fiji, our nearest neighbor. The economy of the GDP last I checked was what, 1.3 trillion US dollars, which is quite huge, as you can understand, for the region. If we know how to work together with our big neighbor. Robin, the threats with the island nations is primarily poverty. That is a threat to us. And because of poverty, we don't always know how to choose our friends. Anyone who comes up with an open checkbook, we embrace them. But a partner of choice is Australia. Australia has always been here with us. And we know that we have benefited a lot from the relationship. There are shared cultural values and all that. I would just like to see more economy, more about the economy to be factored into the geopolitics of the region. Dr. Michael was referring to the huge EEZ in the island countries, and he highlighted about the prevalence of illegal fishing. And I know that one of our commentators is saying that China is interested in the fish stock of the region to feed its people. But we also know that I've always known through other sources that the island countries may not be getting a fair price for their fish stock. And that is compounded by the illegal fishing that we know is happening. So in terms of the relationship with Australia providing security in the region, to monitor the fish stock and make sure that the economic benefits accrue to us in the fullest, we would like to see more involvement by the Australian Navy in this region. And it's a huge part of the Pacific. And that could be one way that we establish security and at the same time ensure that we benefit from the resources from the sea that is being harvested to feed the billions in the northern part of the Pacific. That to me would be quite an initiative that could make a huge difference to us. We're grateful that ODA is favoring us to the tune of $1.something billion. We're grateful for the loan facility that has been recently established. But I think more involvement in growing our economy would be a preferable way to grow the relationship in the region with Australia. As Michael was saying earlier on, that the Australian taxpayers will want their foreign policy to benefit Australia. I am always reluctant to talk about aid. Aid will always be subject to the whims of the politics of the day. I would rather that we work in developing the economies of the region. And I highlighted a particular area because about fish stock. We are small island nations, but huge ocean states. And if that can be an area where Australia can play a big role, I think we could really strengthen the relationship going forward. In terms of the economy also, Australia has helped a lot. I see that from the use of the soft power that I see today. And I do see a lot of it happening now, but there could be a lot more in terms of integrating some of the support system overseas in Australia to in particular the agriculture sector in Fiji. The potential there is huge. It's still very much a small part of our economy. But if we can emulate the support system for agriculture in Australia in Fiji and parts of the region, we can really see some huge development, economy from that sector. For Fiji in tourism, Australia is our biggest market. I'm pleased to see that through the ODA, there is support for our health system. But post-COVID-19, tourists will want to know whether the country they're visiting has a health system that they're comfortable with. My background is tourism, and I know that for the baby boomers, people of my generation in Australia, prefer to go to Asia because of the health systems there than Fiji. And my party, in our manifesto, is looking at building a modern hospital in Nadi to cater to the tourism industry, also the people of Nadi, but something of a standard that can give comfort to the golden oldies, to the baby boomers to come to Fiji. And also one in Suva, an equally sizable hospital. The one we have in Suva was built way back in 1919, and it's about time we have a new one. And that's what our government will be, our party will be focusing on when we come to government. So we will be accessing the loan facilities that are in place. But I think we should recognize that for us, tourism, the health system is very, very critical for us. And I know that the same is true for most of our neighbors in the around the Pacific region. So in summary, Robin and colleagues, yes, we're very much part of Australia. We like the way things are going, but we need to grow the economy from within the region, from within the resources we have, to enable us to be partners with you as part of the region. Like I said, I'm not always one who wants to rely on aid. I don't want it to be part of our part of our GDP. I'd like us to grow our economy with the resources that we have, and I believe we have enough in here to help us grow and reduce poverty. I don't know whether you know that last year there was this household and income and expenditure survey for 2019-2020 that became like a bombshell in Fiji, when we discovered that 3 out of 4 indigenous people are below the poverty line. 4 out of Christians are also poor. And the baseline sustenance there is about $28 Australian a week. So that's the kind of challenges we have. But I know that we can overcome all that with support, and there could be a bit of hand-holding by our big neighbor to help us grow our industry, grow our agriculture, grow our economy, and uplift the standard of living in this country. Our party is also committed to providing free tertiary education all the way to university and technical colleges. And that to me will enable us to move, will help with labor mobility. That we have highly qualified people, and I'm confident that they can move within the region in terms of labor mobility. So I have read quite a bit of work by Dr. Keefe and Tess, and I can see the backdrop in all this. I think in a way, I'm pleased with the way things are going, but I believe we can do better if we focus on the economy of the island countries and remove this threat of poverty. I'll leave it at that for this time, Robin, and thank you for having me in this panel.
Thank you very much, Honorable Gavoka. It's always very good to have somebody like you, somebody from the Parliament, and somebody from politics in Fiji to come and address us on a seminar like this. You brought us very much to the ground level to talk about the standard of living issues. Often, I think Australia is criticised for its consultation processes when it, especially in its aid program, it tends to give what they think we need rather than what we want. And from that perspective, it's very important that we remind them always that, actually we want a better hospital. And the last hospital that, the chief hospital in Fiji was built in 1919. And if you go and look at the standard of the hospital now, it's really breathtaking. It's really very disappointing. And same as talking about fish stocks or the other issues that directly affect us. Thank you very much, and we're now running out of time, and we might have a few minutes to take some questions. I see there's a lot of comments, but not many questions. So one of them, which is there, it's a little bit political, but it's nevertheless very interesting and very relevant. And I'll start with my personal preoccupation with Australian foreign policy that I've had for a number of years. Of course, when I was in the Australian diplomatic service, its focus was very much value-based foreign policy. But now it appears as if geopolitics-based foreign policy dominates Australia. That's my personal opinion. And why I say that, because there's a question over here. It says it sometimes feels that Australia doesn't even bother about the quality of governance in the region. A very pertinent point. Can we have some comments on that? Start with Michael.
Okay, thanks, Robin. It connects back to a point Alex made about one of the real threats of China. And I actually think this goes all the way back to at least 2006. And that is, if they are just interested in buying influence, then they aren't going to have the conditionality which many Pacific Island leaders don't want, because it makes it much more difficult to access aid funds, and it makes it more difficult to, I guess, divert them or focus them in areas of priority for Pacific Island countries. So, so I do think that the values, like you say, have been undermined. And I think all that such amazing work done, the focus of AusAid was on good governance and the whole range of important values which separated Australia from this more instrumental approach. And yes, it is slipping. And now I see the national interest, like you say, being the #1 priority in Canberra. And I think that's a terrible shame. And I think it really undermines Australia's influence. But going back to Honourable Gavoka's comment about poverty, that's where we can connect. Because if poverty and poverty alleviation can be elevated as a priority for Fiji and other Pacific Island countries, then Australia will have to listen. Because we're at the point where Australia is very vulnerable and searching for ways of engaging with Pacific Island countries.
Yes, so would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. No, I think it's a really important issue. I agree with what Michael said. I think we've seen it, we have seen this shift from values-based diplomacy to interests-based diplomacy. That comes with an increased level of transactionalism. I think it also informs some of the rhetoric. Sometimes the rhetoric, and we saw this in Tuvalu and we've seen it elsewhere, in Australian political rhetoric, which it sort of can be condensed into this sense of, look, we give you lots of money, so you need to just be grateful and be quiet. So it almost creates this sense that it's not appropriate to ask questions or critique or criticize how Australia operates. I think it's particularly problematic in relation to places like Fiji and Nauru and PNG, where we have seen really quite egregious aberrations of governance, undermining of democratic principles, trying to dilute the rule of law. And when voices from civil society or the political opposition or academia or the media have turned to Australia for support, they've got nothing. It's just been silence. And it's because of this need to, keep the instrumentalism and the transactionalism going, that whereas previously Australia may have been a bastion for those principles and those values, that now the strategic imperative has stripped all of that out. And it's just like, no, just suck it up and grin and bear it, because we have to keep in there, because otherwise China will get in behind us, will do an end run around us. But what it means is that Australia and Australian expertise and Australian solidarity is really missing in those key areas of governance, whether it's formal institutions or informal networks or whatever it is. That all that work that Ausaid used to do around the good governance stuff, it didn't make for very good photos. There's no exciting photos in making sure that your Ministry of Finance staff can use the finance system and protect government revenues from being pillaged. It's a bit hard to make a, fancy social media video out of that. It's much better to have boxes with red kangaroos stamped all over them arriving and being hauled off airplanes. That makes for much better optics, and it plays much better back at home as well. But in terms of actually supporting where, those governance issues and addressing, because that is the threat, that is one of the main threats that Pacific Islanders feel about China is, we're becoming, it's undermining commitment to the freedom of the press or commitment to civil society having a critical voice. That's where their concerns are. And, Australia is not just the biggest economy, but in theory, the biggest democracy in the region. And its solidarity around that is seen to be waning or absent in some really critical places.
Thank you, Tess. It was most interesting. Thank you very much. When you were talking about photo opportunities, a picture flashed in my mind about Scott Morrison being a water boy on the football field in Suva, running and providing with the players with water. It's more a photo opportunity than rather than real governance. I would like to ask Alex to make a comment on that as well. But Alex, while I ask you that, I'll also read you out a comment here, which says the Lowy Institute did not do any analysis on recent constitutional crisis in Samoa, hardly any analysis on West Papua and Fiji. What is going on? Also, the Melanesian countries where China is aggressively influencing Fiji, Solomon Islands, and the PNG. So would you be able to make comment if Lowy Institute is paying enough attention to the Pacific Islands, or do they need more resources to do that?
That's a great question. What's the name of the person who asked this? I mean, just like to address him by name, to address the person by name.
His name is Sanjay Ramesh.
Sanjay, well, Sanjay, thank you very much for the question. Look, it is a great question. The Lowy Institute, we are like a foreign policy think tank, and but as you can imagine, we have limited resources. Yes, so on the Pacific, we are only 3 people covering the region. So, and we try to cover as much as we can. But you're right, like that sometimes we can't deal with certain things. We did write a paper on West Papua though, so I can tick this box and say that we did it. But with respect to the Samoan constitutional crisis, we all actually followed the issue quite closely. But we also felt that that wasn't really our place to comment on this issue. Like there were a lot of people in Samoa really, looking at what was happening, already commenting on what was going on. And so we all prefer, like in the Pacific team, we all prefer, we are here to help in whatever way we can the region, but we don't want to also comment or like take the place or like take the airtime of people who would have like a better understanding of the situation than us. So this is why we didn't comment that much on Samoa. You're talking about Fiji. We do quite a lot of work on Fiji. Personally, so the Honorable Gavoka, I wanted to rebound actually on your comment with respect to the economy, because we've done a lot of work on the economic recovery in the Pacific, notably looking at Fiji, and like to us, it is clear that the problem in Fiji is not so much a problem of liquidity, of solvency. Sorry, there's a more problem of liquidity. Like we need to give more cash to Fiji to continue to recover from the crisis, and we need to do the same for like many other countries. The issue for Australia, I think, with respect to the Fijian economy, is that it is difficult to give additional loans because the principle of helping one country or another are actually bounded by the rules that the IMF are setting. And if the IMF believes that a country is facing a situation of debt distress or like a high risk of debt distress, then like it would be very difficult for Australia to provide additional concessional loans or to justify it within the department. So I think there is actually a huge appetite to help the economy, like the region recovers economically, and including Fiji. But I know that people actually are working on this. And finally, sorry, just Robin on the aid question. The fact that like the diplomacy is not so much value based anymore; it's more like interest based. I completely agree, and I think also that. You shouldn't generalize too much, right? Like there are things that are value based, but like aid is in some ways, like aid is not altruistic anymore. Like we are like investing. Australia is investing in the region because it is part of its defense strategy to have like a stable and peaceful in the Pacific. Sorry. And so this is why, like, I think you're seeing this shift, and Tess is completely right. This is a bit unfortunate, and you're seeing outpouring reactions from people in the FAT when they talk to former presidents or prime ministers, with respect to the aid or like the money being disbursed in the region. But I agree, like, a bit more should be done, and like a redirecting or like a more value-based approach should be taken.
Thank you very much, Alex. Well, just my comment. I tend to agree with Sanjay that probably Lowy Institute could do a little bit more on governance issues in the Pacific, and particularly in countries like Fiji. Thank you.
We'll try.
Thank you very much. I think your time's up, really. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for a very interesting afternoon. And I saw that there's a lot of people following and listening in from the region as a whole. And from that point of view, I think that this session has been very successful, and particularly on this particular topic, Australia and the Pacific Islands, yep. Australia being so important. I'd like to thank the Fiji Institute of Applied Studies for initiating, hosting, and facilitating this series of online seminars on international and regional issues, which are contemporary issues and of direct interest to the sub-region and direct interest to our people. They're very much interested in it. So thank you very much, and thank you all. Any other comments before I close?
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Tess, Alex, and of course, Honorable Gavoka.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
by